Great. Thank you so much, Devin. And just want to say, I think this is just a fantastic idea to have a way for us all to get together. So I'm really excited that Human Energy has sort of tried to promote this and for to kind of cultivate a space for conversation. We had the fantastic conference back in December in Morocco, and I think that was a great opportunity to hear from everybody, to hear talks and the like. And where a lot of the energy was in the kind of coffee break after the talks. Certainly there was energy during the talks, but there's also that space that I think is really important for us in terms of trying to understand what it is we're talking about now, and what better way to do that than to engage in dialogue. And so I'm really excited about that. You and Devin, Sheila, and everyone else who's been helping to organize this. So thanks so much.
Yeah, and with this idea of what is it that we're talking about as an organization called human energy, you have a theory on human energy. So it was a very fitting start to diving deeper into our community conversation about what we're up to as a community and what we're trying to accomplish, what kind of impact we're trying to create on the world, what we're trying to inspire in each individual. So to start us off, we want to just dive into what drew you to the concept of human energy in the first place. What inspired you to explore these ideas?
Yeah, so that was, as you noted, the theme of the presentation, and has been something that's just been lurking in my mind from the beginning. As soon as I heard about the organization, Human Energy, as soon as Ben Kassira, our late founder and inspirer, brought us into this, I was always thinking, so what is this? What is this about, and how does this relate to all of the different ideas that are engaged and involved with human energy? And so the project for me has evolved over many years. But just to kind of cut to the chase, I think in terms of the topic for today, it's very much inspired by what I think is one of the mottos that's listed on the website for Human Energy, right? So it says Human Energy cultivating humanity's collective potential. And so it's been a question to me. Well, so what is that? What do we mean by that? And when we talk about energy, potential energy, are we really talking about this in terms of is this a metaphor? I think that's one of the questions I suspect we'll get into today. Is this a metaphor? Can we study energy science, this sort of human energy scientifically? And what do we mean by that? And I think that at least for me, the idea of human energy and this idea of cultivating our potential, looking towards the future, our sort of future in terms of our evolution as a species, has a lot to do with what kind of future we want. Do we want a future where we're alive and flourishing, not just merely surviving, but one where we're really cultivating a place where we're thriving as humans and as individuals and as a collective? And so that's really where this idea takes off for me, is that there's something about human energy that's different about other forms of energy. And I do think it's more than quote unquote just a metaphor. So just to touch on that briefly so that we can build off of it, is that we need biological energy, we need metabolism, we need all of this to survive. There's no question about the importance of energy for biological survival. But our capacity to thrive, our capacity to flourish, is something more than just surviving, right? It's about the ethics, it's about the morals, perhaps even about our spiritual leanings, our sense of making meaning as human beings. And this requires something more, I think, than just this sort of biological energy. But I think this idea of human energy is necessary. And so that's sort of where I started to dive in with this, and where I wanted to go.
Well, thank you for setting the table and introducing some of these fundamental concepts and aspects of what we'll be talking about today. So I'll start to dive into some of our user submitted questions. We got them from emails, we got them from our submission form online, getting them from our chat today. Truly a noospheric kind of conversation that we want to have here, where we're generating a collective consciousness by asking each other questions and having thoughtful response. So this first one's from Marwan in Morocco, and his question is, how has your own experience of human energy evolved throughout your life? Have there been moments where you felt particularly attuned or disconnected from it?
Well, great question. As you and I were talking earlier, Devin Marwan has submitted a bunch of wonderful questions, so I'm excited to hear from him. And we connected at the conference. Um, to start, I think it's worth just really emphasizing here that when I'm talking about human energy and the way that I'd like to use it, and the way that I'd encourage us also to think about it, is to emphasize part of this experiential aspect. And I think that's part of the, just in terms of understanding that for us having a common language to talk about this question is how do we experience human energy, and that it's actually an experiential domain. And one of the things that I tried to sort of put forward the idea is that it's our feeling of being really alive, like more than just, surviving, but meta alive, what Teilhard talked about as the zest for life. So I sort of see uh, the idea of flourishing as sort of a description of societies, of communities, and that the human energy, the experiential side of that is this sort of aliveness capacity. And so I think that that's a really important point that would be great to emphasize through this question, that our experience, it's not just I'd like to talk about things that are not just merely abstract. We want to talk about things that will help us understand our connection to our collective society, our collective humanity, and collective consciousness in that way. So you know, with respect to my own engagement in here, I would say in my own personal experience with human energy, I think this is something that's kind of always been on the back of my mind. I don't know if I ever really had a word for it. But we go through our lives, we know there are certain things that we're drawn to, certain things that inspired me, certain things that excited me, both like as a human being, but also in my academic life, in my family life. And so it's really interesting to sort of see there's all this resonance. It doesn't depend on being like just an intellectual idea, but this could be a very practical idea of when my son was born or when my daughter was born. These are moments of profound transformative experiences, and experiences that where we feel really alive. So what is that about? I think it's part of what inspired me to pursue this further.
Well, yeah, and building off of this practical application and experience of human energy, we have a question around how do you how does your understanding and cultivation of human energy address specific needs in your own life or your mind? And additionally, how do you see it meeting the needs of communities and society as a whole? And one thing I'll say is just with human energy, we want to obviously offer ideas, but we want to be very sensitive and responsive to the needs of the moment, of society as a whole. And I think that there's a lot that energy has to offer, and the concept in terms of meeting people's needs. Do you have any reflections on that?
I do. There's something I want to just start off by saying, which is going to be, I'll give you the short answer, and then there'll be a slightly longer answer. One answer that you'll probably hear from me if we do enough of these questions is I don't know. I think that's going to be a really important answer that's going to come from me, and that there's a very specific quality to that I don't know. But I just want to start with that. And But before I kind of say a few more words about that, there's one more link I think is worth drawing between the idea of flourishing and the idea of the experience of human energy, and that's to the idea of evolution, and specifically the idea of evolvability. And so I want to just point out that this work that I'm working on, this doesn't just come from me. These are ideas that I've sort of cultivated and borrowed, and really benefited from the collective works of everybody here in the human energy team, and many of the scientists. I don't have a background in evolution to begin with, but have been inspired by by Terry, by David Sloan Wilson, to think about that. And so what I want to just offer here, and I think it's important in terms of trying to understand this question, is that the while flourishing may be the description of the sort of society that we want or the noosphere we want, we'll probably come to that term later, and while aliveness may be the sort of experiential dimensions, I think that we really have to understand evolution and evolvability as the mechanism, as the how. How is it that this energy gets us to flourishing? Otherwise, we're going to be just describing these terms, which I think is fine. I think it's good to have a good language, but as a scientist, I also want to know, like, how does this work? What is this about? So then back to the question of, and I might need to have to rephrase it a little bit to jog my memory on it, but it was something about how do we apply this to communities in need, and
Yeah,
how do we
just
actually cultivate,
yeah,
right?
the present needs of I think of things like the digital deluge of maybe a maladaptive relationship to the noosphere or just
Yeah,
information in general, the diminishment of human energy throughout society because of things like brain rot or techno addiction, where people are not feeling like they're flourishing and maybe feeling, less than in some way, both at the individual or community kind of level. And how can just, awareness and cultivation of human energy, to me it gives me hope. And I'm just
yeah,
curious about, how you see it, as a concept becoming more widespread throughout society and being effective.
yeah. So this gets back to the I don't know part, right? Which is
Yeah.
that if if part of human energy and the sort of experiential dynamic of that is one where we start to encourage and support creativity, creative process that might power evolution, or compassionate activities that will also get us outside of ourselves and connected to others so that um, uh, the collective can flourish. The question is, what do we actually do to make that happen? What actually cultivates that? And actually, I think that's actually where the I don't know part comes in really strongly with this concept of negative capability, which is that uh, was a concept came from the poet Keats, defined by the capacity to rest in mysteries, uncertainties, and doubts, without irritably reaching after fact or reason. So this is one of those terms that I actually sort of really try to live my life by. It's not always perfect, um, but I think that just as a starting place, we have to come in with like a really strong sense of humility and openness, to the ways that a brilliant, new, innovative, creative, technological idea has transformed things, and then has these unintended side effects and consequences that we hadn't anticipated, and then as a result of that, where do we, how do we address that? And we have to go through these cycles of sort of openness and unsurety. I see someone put in the chat, what was the term again? There was a few. What's that?
I think I'm guessing that she's negative capability that you were just referring to.
Yes, exactly. Negative capability by the poet Keats. Um, and that's the capacity to rest in mysteries, uncertainties, and doubts. And so I think that that's part of how the evolutionary mechanism proceeds in some sense. Organisms can't predict. They make efforts to do so, but they don't know uh, where evolution is going. But we might try to stack the deck, so to speak, to sort of put our energy in certain places, in a sort of more generic, like, this is where I think we need to go. But then we don't know whether the specific path that we're on is going to be the one to get us there. So it may be a little bit of an unsatisfying answer, in terms of like the real specifics. Like, this is where we should invest, and this is what we should do. And maybe we have another AMA to with more practically oriented types to help to generate, to sort of get that brainstorming going, because I'm not at all opposed to that. But I think in certain aspects premature to know exactly what it would
Yeah.
be.
I'm just hoping that you'd say human energy will just solve all of the world's problems and we could just, go relax from there. But that is part of the purpose of human energy, the organization, is that we want to hold space for these conversations to happen, to where we can start to find the answers together. And from these conversations, move into other initiatives, other projects. Maybe it's the development of technology or events or organizations or coalitions to address these mysteries and uncertainties together. So got one from Abe, who's our wonderful video editor. He asks, are there any recent studies showing how cells or the brain changes, adapts, or evolves in response to major life changes? Specifically, is there any research around how a person's cellular or neural state changes over time? And he's specifically interested in like the year 2000 versus today, and examining how the use of technology is impacting our biology and evolution, and by extension, our capacity for human energy.
Hi, Abe. That's a really challenging question to sort of try to imagine in some sense, how different are we as a species than we were, uh, you know, uh, 20, 30, 40 years ago. Um, I'm not as sure of any studies that directly, have assessed the sort of changes, but it's actually that's what the brain does, though, of course, right? The brain is all about plasticity, neuroplasticity. So there's a whole host of studies that have shown, for example, that um, our musculoskeletal system is not shaped the same way as a result of us holding our phones. We have new problems and inflammation in our joints from using our thumb to text, and our necks are kind of hunched over, and there's all these new medical problems that have resulted. That those aren't exactly probably the ones you were hoping to hear about. But there's no question that our brain has completely readapted to technology, but we've always been doing that. Our brain has been readapting to technology for millennia. It's just happening at this much more accelerated pace today, and so that I think that's an important point. I would, it, you know, I would emphasize going ahead and take a look at go Google one of the videos to see how quickly neural spines regrow in conditions, and within like a minute you can get a new little connection that forms between neurons as a result of learning and memory and those sorts of tasks. So there's no question that we're changing. I missed that thing that just flashed up in the chat there, but
Yeah, we have a question. So Grant, and Grant will start to move. Thank you for submitting
okay.
them. We will start to move into user submitted or audience submitted questions here shortly. So I encourage you to continue to submit questions. And if you are willing to ask it on the stage, just please request to speak on stage and we'll take it from there. In the meantime, I'd like to get to a question from our colleague Boris in Los Angeles, who asked, in your talk, you connect dark energy from the cellular level to the brain and ultimately to human creativity in the noosphere. His question is about the intermediate levels between individuals and the planetary noosphere, such as nation states or religious traditions. When we feel alive within these collective structures, does that mean they are alive as well? Are we these structures dark energy? If we apply this framework to collectives like nations, what makes the noosphere distinct? Is it simply a matter of scale being planetary, or does the noosphere capture something fundamentally different than living in a nation or religious tradition? And I did my best to bring Boris's voice into the space. And if there's any table setting you want to do around the noosphere, feel free. But I imagine most here are familiar.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Boris. That's a really important question. I think it's probably just worth mentioning we're at a moment in time where I think there's a lot of uncertainty at the nation state level. And so these questions about our allegiances and identities with respect to country versus community versus city are really on people's minds at the moment. And so just to acknowledge that. Um, you're right, Devin. We probably should take a moment here and talk about, maybe give some uh, discussion around the noosphere. But before maybe mentioning that, part of the crux I hear of Boris's question is, right, if the no, you know, so then for the noosphere, right, everybody has their own definition, right, which is what's so fun. I tend to think of it very much in terms of geosphere, biosphere, noosphere as first as an ecosystem. And so in the same way that the biosphere is the extension of life on the planet, I think of the noosphere as the extended symbolic communication and intersubjective space of human mentality. And I think that also includes our supporting technology and structures, that material that makes that possible too. So and while the noosphere has this potential, almost, I guess, maybe meta ecosystem kind of idea, clearly it's a complex ecosystem no matter what. It also brings with it, and Teilhard brought with this idea, of course, that it's an organism or a superorganism in its own right. And that was where some of the work that I've been doing with human energy really started, was on this question of, first, well, is it a brain? How can we study it? Is it a brain? And is it an organism? And actually, I sort of really started to think that those two questions were related and actually really important, that if we were trying to think about it as a collective brain or as a collective mind, we probably also had to think about what the collective body would be. And so thinking about it as an organism makes just as much sense as thinking about it as a brain. So then we're really up to this question of, okay, so um, at what point does an organism or a superorganism become alive in its own right? And in some sense, it's almost a little easier to, right, metaphorically describe meta-aliveness than it is to describe what it means to be alive. We have a lot of brilliant biologists, some of whom I think maybe have joined us today, who have been studying this question. And I think it's a really powerful, a really challenging question. It surprised me that we still today don't, everybody has a different definition of that. So that being said, I do think, with respect to Boris's question about, communities being alive in a sort of biological sense versus the planet, I think there's a distinct there's a difference at the planetary scale, and I think it has to do around identity. I know that's a topic that Boris has really been engaged with. I think that we can all have an identity as an American, as a San Franciscan, and there are certain aspects of the built environment and my material cultural inheritance that support that. But I think that that entity could sort of more or less, the material support for that entity could dissolve, or the culture could change and shift, and people could go to other places. It doesn't have the same. It has more of a porousness, and I don't see it as an organism. Maybe that's partly my bias, but I think at planetary scale, there's a much deeper entanglement between our identity as human beings and our actual survival. That's where the resources are, and so while it's true that there's exchange across country, there's exchanges across countries. That sort of goes to show that I think that there's that gets coordinated by information. But I think that ultimately the point that I'm trying to make here, which is a difficult one, is that there's the information, what organizes our identity, is really deeply entangled with our environmental, economic, energy supports. How do we keep ourselves going as a species? And I think that that's a very different sort of, to me, that evokes more of the organism level, and could talk about it in greater detail, but it might get too complicated.
I think you spoke to the heart of Boris's question, and like I think a lot of these responses, it's going to open up a whole vista for further conversation. David, if you would like to be our first audience member to step on stage, says that he has a question that he could ask. There's a button on the bottom that says, I believe, request to speak, and there we go.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep. Thank you,
Gotcha.
David.
Awesome. Great. Well, hello everyone, and great to be here. I think that there's something that we might be overlooking, perhaps because it seems so mundane, and that is how organisms, including the human organism, allocates its energy to multiple tasks. So it's a very, very complex trade-off decision. Do you spend it on the immune system? Do you spend it on this or that? Do you spend it at all, or do you reserve it? And against that background, you can be in a situation where you're in highly approach mode, something that's so alluring that you're just expending all your energy in one direction to get something which is like really cool, let's say. And so there's a big unleashing of energy basically in that direction. And that is a feeling of euphoria. I think a small version of that is what you did in your exercise, Michael, in your talk when you asked people to turn their neighbor and just say a little bit to their neighbor. And all of a sudden, there was this awakening because you had a human being that was somewhat interesting. And as you put it, you come alive. But I feel that that could be explained in large part from an energy allocation model, which is therefore something we want to include when we think of all of these different forms of human energy. It's very mundane, but I think it might be quite apropos to the experience of unleashing human energy in, in some situations. So I wanted to put that on the table.
Thank you, David.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I appreciate actually the use of the word mundane here, in some sense, and I know my reading of what you're saying, or hearing of what you're saying, right, is that it's not to trivialize that. It's actually to sort of really exemplify the simple exchanges that we have in life, the sort of more basic understanding of energy in our felt experience of it. And so I appreciate that. And the way that I'm hearing the allocation piece of it, right, is that and this is something that I've been trying to make clear in the more sort of technical writing on this on this topic, is that all of these processes are nested inside the other. It's not quite like a Maslow's hierarchy per se, but it seems very clear to me that our biological energy in terms of how we allocate energetic resources in any given particular situation, typically like neuroendocrine system, right, as it's sort of trying to evaluate particular environmental needs and then recalibrating, sending hormones to increase our energy to shift things to the muscles when we need to activate them, or to the digestive system when we need to allocate energy in that particular way. I think is definitely part and parcel of what biology is about, and that sort of that aspect of it is engaged. So when we're experiencing close connection, social connection with others, in particular, right, this will also activate all of that biological and bioenergetics. So I don't doubt that at all. I think that that's quite critical to the idea of human energy. What I think differentiates it is the way that it's pulling us like kind of outside of our individual selves and individual perspectives. So that it's not located necessarily in me, but that it reflects something that gets me to engage with other people.
Oh, Michael,
Something,
I actually have a quote from Teilhard on just that point, so I'll let that
yeah.
finish up my little segment here. There is almost a sensual longing for communion with others who have a large vision. The immense fulfillment of the friendship between those engaged in furthering the evolution of consciousness has a quality impossible to describe. So there's the act of becoming part of something larger than yourself, really, including joining a group that's thinking about becoming something larger than yourself. For that, I think is I think a good example about when you're in that situation, you love it so much and you're so longing for it that you'll hurl yourself in that direction. You'll marshal all of your energy in that one direction, and that would be an unleashing of human energy. So that was the main point that I was wanting
Yeah,
to
I
make.
like that's a fantastic quote. I don't know if I've heard of that one yet, but I think that that's part of when that unleashing is exactly what I would be driving at with the idea of human energy. But and that it's in some sense it's not just about me. It's not just about particularly it's also just
Right.
not about my survival, right? At that point, and human history is just full of these remarkable examples, and that's what makes flourishing such an interesting topic. You take someone like Viktor Frankl, for example, who survived, Nazi Holocaust camps, and felt as if his mind was flourishing as he was holding to his ideas, writing his book, holding it in his head this entire time. There's something quite remarkable about what we're willing to sort of forgo, even in the sort of transcending our need for survival in that way. And that's the way that I would kind of want us to start to study, what is that about, and what does that say about our evolutionary processes and our capacity for conscious evolution?
I think if you could imagine you're lost in the desert and you're about to die of thirst, and then you stumble upon an oasis, the joy of that would be, and the energy with which you would run towards the oasis, that's purely individual, but I think it's the same joy. So I think that just to make that point, it's individual survival, but I think we want to dignify, not to denigrate individual survival. Anyhow, happy to make that point. Now I'm going to return to the audience.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Steve.
And thank you for being our first brave guinea pig to step from the audience to the speaker section as we figure out this Discord stage system. So we are in a point of the program where if you do have questions, I encourage you to either type them in the chat or to request to speak. How does the concept of autopoiesis as in generative process and biology relate to our experience of creativity and generativity? She asked us to consider that ideas like cognition that extend beyond the brain, like externalist and inactivist theories, could create dark energy, be seen as something that operates not just in individual minds, but across neural, cultural, technological, and ecological systems. So she asked how this challenges the idea that cognition is limited to the brain alone.
Yeah. So if you spend enough time hanging out with someone like Terry Deacon, you'll probably learn pretty quick that cognition is not limited to the brain alone. That there are a lot of external supports, and the embodied cognition and activist models that you describe help us realize that the brain and body co-evolved of course, with its environment, and is profoundly shaped by those aspects. The question sort of starts with a kind of an initial nod to this idea of autopoiesis, which I had mentioned, I think, in my presentation, the term autopoiesis meaning sort of self-creating system. It's often used in cybernetic communities and biology to describe what might be thought of as some of the minimal conditions that are necessary for life. Somehow it's able to sustain and recreate itself. I find that this term can be helpful as a sort of description, and it is useful in that way, but I'm not sure that it has much by way of its like process. Like, so how does this actually happen? What makes something truly autopoietic, self-creating, and so in that sense, and this may just partly be my ignorance of the field, that I don't know how an autopoietic system adds much in terms of creativity. So it seems to me that autopoiesis in some ways may just be defined by the ability to sort of self-sustain, or maybe have some systems to regulate or adapt to the environment. But in the sense of what makes an individual organism so potentially powerful is that baked into its inheritance system, DNA, is the ability, I don't forget the author who quoted it this way, to blunder slightly. The great wonder of DNA is its capacity to blunder slightly, to sort of have mutations. I mean, this is one of the driving forces of evolution, and folks like E.O. Wilson have tried to use models of creativity that are geared around this idea, both a sort of random mutation and then selection of beneficial mutations, that the creative process is somehow analogous to this. I think that they're onto something with that, but I think that that model of creativity is leaving out some of the more generative aspects, and particularly the aspects of the term that's now called evolvability, which is that the organism and the lineage has a capacity to try to enhance the probability of a particular evolutionary outcome. So some ways that this happens in the way that it's been studied most specifically as sort of increased mutation rates under certain times of stress, but only for certain parts of the genome. So it's like, I'm going to just try a bunch of things over here in the hopes that something is going to work out. It's like I think of it as something kind of like brainstorming. It's not quite fair, but I think the brain also does something similar in terms of our capacity for associative um, uh, imagination. And I think that this is the part of creativity that I'm not sure we quite have a handle on yet. Clearly, we know how to refine and select, but then there's the generative aspect of it that I think is really critical. And I think that that's part of what human energy is inspiring, the latent energy for engagement in a creative process.
Thank you. And yeah, there's so much more to explore down that route, but we'll continue to move through the various questions. And again, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat or to ask to speak on stage. This next question comes from Robert Kuhn, who spoke at N2 2023, public speaker and host of the Closer to Truth series. He asked, how do you see the future of neuroscience evolving in 10, 25, and 50 years, particularly in our relation to understanding human energy and the noosphere? What advancements might emerge as we study consciousness, cognition, and collective intelligence of the noosphere over these timeframes?
Predictions.
Yeah. And we'll have it on record, so we'll visit it in 50 years from now to see if you're right or wrong.
Time capsules kind of lose their fun that way, right? I mean, into the days of burying it in your backyard. I think that's gone, isn't it?
Yeah.
Interesting. I hadn't thought about that as a noospheric mechanism. So Yogi Berra predictions are difficult, especially about the future. And if you probably gathered my philosophy on not knowing, then would probably double down there. But that being said, in neuroscience, which is I think where this question was driving at, there's just profound changes that are underway, right? And I think that the computational and machine learning world and our technological sophistication is allowing us to, quote unquote, decode the things, what people are thinking, this sort of thing. And I think that in that sense, in the next 10 years, that's going to take off. There's going to be just massive amounts of brain neurotechnology integration. We may be reading the minds of others, each other. The computers will be doing it. We'll be freely offering that up. The problem is that I don't know that we'll have any understanding of what the actual physiology is. I mean, I think that the machine learning will do a good job of predicting what we're thinking, but it may not tell us how the brain works or fundamentally what the physiology is about. It probably will help there. And so, my particular inclination based on where some of my research efforts are in neuroscience is to think about energy, not human energy to a certain degree, but also in large part the metabolic and the blood flow, the blood and guts of the brain, so to speak, that I think these are parts of the nervous system that get a little bit neglected when we take on sort of a neurocentric model of how the brain works, and that these other energetic supports within the brain are really necessary for determining the what it feels like dimension to human experience. So that would be one other prediction I might have. And then the last one is that if you look at the history of science and the structures of scientific revolutions, is that we're going to be so wrong about something probably really fundamental. Um, and we won't be able to know what that is right now. And it may be like some of our basic assumptions about mind, about matter. I don't know, and that those will they may not actually change the science, but it may change the type of questions we ask, and that's where I just sort of would have to leave it. I mean, um, I'm not so bullish on like sort of quantum effects kind of driving the brain. Certainly interesting and possible, but clearly there are quantum effects. But there's something fundamental kind of like that, but I don't know what it will be. Exciting. Maybe I'll probably be dead by then, though. So
Thank you for foraying into the tenuous field of predictions. And I will delete the footage so that there's no record.
no record of that.
Right or
Okay,
wrong.
looks like maybe
To
Alan has
go from
it.
predictive to a bit more reflective, again, a question from Marwan is you emphasize that narrativity, music, and poetry are essential to understanding the noospheric and human energy as scientific inquiry. So is there anything you want to say on this other side of the conversation? And he asked, what has been the most poetic or awe-inspiring moment of your scientific career?
Yeah. The humanities have been like an inspiration for me throughout my work, and a lot of that comes from being able to connect with a lot of my colleagues through human energy, so that this truly is like an interdisciplinary project and not just a sort of siloed one. And music in particular has been a guiding model. I mean, metaphor is to sort of not strong enough in a way of describing um, uh, how I think of like how the brain works first and foremost. And so it may not be that the brain is a computer in the way that we traditionally think of it, but the way that the way that it makes sense of its world, not just processing information, but the way that it makes sense of it is more like the way that we make sense of a piece of music. And that it has this sort of felt experience, a narrative, may even have like a narrative overarching structure to it. And so that's the way that I think about how human energy, how we exchange. We're not like bits of information. I'm just gonna like download to you, Devin, and tell you a few yes no answers to some of these questions, and we'll move on. Hopefully something gets evoked in you on the basis of our conversation or anybody else that gets them thinking about something. Maybe it had nothing to do with like the content of what we're talking about, which makes it also really interesting. Maybe just evoke something exciting in you and you go down this other path. That's a really different model for how a system communicates. And I think human energy is a way of trying to speak to that as a way of working. And the other aspect to his question was moments in my career or life that were like,
Inspiring moments in your own scientific career. So I think he's looking to weave together the poetic and your scientific experience, and pinpoint if there's just moments where a scientific experience elicited those moments of awe or musicality or cultivation of human energy in you.
yeah. I think of there's two that come kind of immediately to mind. One was the first time that I um, listened to neural activity. So if you are a neurophysiologist, typically a way that neurons are studied in an organism that's sort of behaving in some way, that there has to be an electrode placed somewhere into their brain, and this will measure the change in voltage, the electrical potential, which will be hooked up to a computer that reads all this out. But and I think they still do it this way, hook it up to a speaker so that you can hear the chatter, so that you can identify it. And the first time that I was able to hear this electrical activity while there was like an organism watching something on a screen, and seeing how there was this interaction with it was sort of the first moment of inspiration for me. Just like, wow, there's something going on here. It's just this shattering of noise, and it didn't sound any, or it didn't have any particular organization to it. I was like, how could this be encoding information? This is wild. What is this about? And there's a follow-up to this, which was uh, a few years ago, working with my colleague Parham, I think is with us. Um, I've always been interested in the what are called dynamical systems approaches to understanding like brain, and comes from like the world of chaos theory. And so I'd always read this book that my father had on chaos and fractals, and he had this really cool picture, a they're really cool book, and has all these graphical depictions of these like complex, swirling, strange attractors. Maybe you guys have all seen this now at this point, this kind of thing. And I was like, boy, that would be so cool to study the brain that way. And it really wasn't until, about 5, 6 years ago, the first time that I tried to do that, and said, wow, that's creating this structure out of this crazy neural chatter that I heard, 25 years ago. And there's this kind of there's this organization to it. I don't know what it's about, but I want to keep exploring it. So that probably those are two of the most awe-inspiring moments for me as a scientist.
I think there's a lot that we can do with that, and now I'm wondering if we should ever release a Spotify playlist of neural chatter of various experiences.
I'm sure somebody has done something
Share the
like
awe.
it.
Well, we got a great question from Alan, another producer and documentarian as part of Human Energy, and we have Carol requesting to speak. So we'll start with Alan's question, and then Carol will get to you. Feel free to type your question in the chat first so that we can see and reference it. Alan, and I don't know, Alan, you're here. If you'd like to just pose the question yourself, feel free. If not, I'm happy to read it on your behalf. You would have to request to speak. I will go ahead and read it on your behalf for now, and feel free to jump in. Alan asks, how might your understanding of the role of human energy in the noosphere influence our decisions on how we implement and regulate artificial intelligence? So, big topic.
Yeah, big topic, good question. Again, I don't know, but I really don't. I mean, it's there's so much kind of political, you know, uh, excitement surrounding this, right? Do we regulate it? Do we not regulate it? Is it going to take off? Who's discovering what, or discover what's the real impact it's going to have? I I would really encourage everyone to catch Parham's discussion of this from the conference. I think that that's something that the two of us, and also Terry, has discussed quite a lot with respect to artificial intelligence, and what, well, first of all, just knowing what that really is. And so I think human energy is a way of making some clearer distinctions between how humans work, how our brains work, how our hearts and minds work in ways that are very different from artificial intelligence works as a sort of basically glorified statistical regression system. And so I think it's going to has the potential to be highly catalytic with respect to human energy. And so I would love to see, and I mean, that's how I use current large language model AI systems, is to sort of dump some of my ideas and see what I'm missing, see who else has thought about this, and then that gets me to look somewhere else. But it's rare that those models are developing novel ideas per se in terms of creativity, and despite the statement that some people rate AIs as being more compassionate. Uh, Sometimes if they're blinded in chats. Um, I have my doubts about the significance of that as a mental health provider. And compassion is far more subtle than just what gets written. But it's what's communicated and what's lasting and how is it received, and just intellectually versus felt and experienced. So it doesn't entirely answer your question, Alan, with respect to like how do we regulate it, but I certainly think um, that those might be the ideas that people who know something about the way of regulating things or testing out the waters. Obviously, we want to be able to support the creativity of the sort of AI revolution, so to speak. But I'm very sensitive to the Tristan Harris and the sort of Center for Humane Technology folks and their recognition that, well, hey, look, social media had a lot of unintended consequences. And so that's probably where I'll have. I mean, here we are. We're on social. Is this Discord social media, right, Devin? I think we can sort
Okay.
of call it social
Yeah.
media. So maybe here's to hoping it supports us.
Yeah, I will say I don't know. This doesn't speak to the political regulation of it, but just in terms of my own relationship to artificial intelligence, the distinction you make between human energy and maybe a more textured layer version of compassion that's available from a human versus artificial intelligence, just immediately I can kind of re-regulate how I understand to relate to artificial intelligence. So I think there's some distinction capacity for introducing this concept in terms of how we relate to new technologies. So thank you, Alan, and as always, we welcome your thoughts on these ideas. All right, Carol, let's see. I'm going to invite you to speak, and I believe you'll have to join the stage. Here we are. Your mic is currently muted. But if you can unmute your mic, you can speak to. We have about 5 more minutes of our official programming. We will wind things down after that. Michael, did you want to stay around to see if there was any lingering questions?
Yeah, I'm happy to stay around. I don't have a firm stop at the hour, so if
Okay.
there's more conversation to be had. Although I
Yeah,
don't know that I have the way of, I don't know if I have a way of allowing people to speak or not, but we can figure that out later.
we'll figure that out. And then, yeah, because I just imagine Parham has something to say. I see him in here. But yeah, Carol, if you'll might just, yeah, the speaker issues, the microphone issue is a thing. You can go to another question while we wait for Carol. This one just came in today that I think is an interesting and simple. I should feel free to try again, Carol. But Francis asked online, and I think this is a helpful clarifying question: is human energy synonymous with consciousness? And do other sentient beings have access to this energy as well? And just thinking about other modes of life, and if so, how does it manifest across different species? So highly speculative, but with this meta aliveness being coined as human energy, how does it show up in the rest of the web of life?
Yeah, it's a great question. It feels also a little analogous to me, a question that comes up a lot around the noospheres. Is this Gaia? How does the biosphere relate to the noosphere? And I there's a few dimensions to this question. One is kind of the metaphysics of that, like what is consciousness? I'm just going to set that just gently aside for a second. But first would be just to come to terms around consciousness, which is used in a lot of different ways. I think of believe it's one of David Chalmers' breakdowns in terms of phenomenal consciousness, that sort of what we experience. Then there's kind of meta consciousness, our capacity to reflect upon the contents of consciousness. And I think when we're talking about consciousness, just colloquially, we're often kind of talking in that way. Like, did it come to your, let's have a consciousness raising experience. We're thinking about this, we're talking about it, it's in our consciousness, it's circulating. But that's not always the way that it's used in sort of philosophical circles and sort of metaphysical conversation about what is the nature of consciousness, what is this experience that we have. But I think that both are really important with respect to human energy. Uh, so I think there's something really distinct and different about human beings and our capacity for symbolic consciousness and symbolic cognition. And while I think other animals have experience. I think they have sentient experience. I think they feel what's going on. I think sentience is baked into biology, if you will. Would be more willing to extend that all the way down to the most rudimentary form of sentience in sort of a bacteria that's feeling. There's some sort of responsiveness, even if it's very rudimentary there. But I think that human energy is why we're calling it human energy and not biological energy or some other form of energy. Um, and so might it be that energy itself and consciousness are somehow related in a deep way, in a sort of more metaphysical way? Um, I'm probably a little more willing than my more materialist colleagues to be open-minded to these sorts of possibilities, in terms of understanding and what's most fundamental about our, the nature of reality, not how it works, but its actual nature. Like, what is it? What is this made of? Is it all matter? Is it all mind? Is there some interaction between the two? I tend to not prefer dualism as an explanatory framework. Um, and I find panpsychism, the sort of idea that, well, there's different aspects of it, sort of be kind of like as a way of kind of embracing dualism still. So, um, and maybe this is more than what you're getting at with your question, Francis, but I think since we've spoke before, I have a sense of also of your interest here. And so in that sense, I'd be willing to be more open-minded and sort of, well, it might be that really fundamentally the nature of, metaphysically speaking, is the nature of reality is something more like mind, more like consciousness, and matter is just what it looks like to us. Um, but these are philosophical questions. I don't think we answer them scientifically. They will inform our scientific approaches, but I'm not sure that they would change. Um, but the science will still work, whether we call it all matter or we call it all mind. I still think it's the same, the way that science works out, but it might affect the way we approach the questions. Anyway, long story of saying, yeah, I think there's something interesting here about energy. Like, what is, fundamentally, we don't know what that is. I mean, it's the capacity to perform work, but what is, you know? Anyway, I'll stop.
No, and thank you. I think inspiring, open-ended philosophical question is a wonderful place for us to land and to move into the weekend with. This is the first of many Ask Me Anything events where we'll be continuing to hold space to address these questions. We can't really tell what they're going to inspire in terms of increasing our capacity to address them both as individuals, in collaboration, and in communities. So please keep the questions coming and provide feedback in the chat or to hello@humanenergy.com on what you're looking for in these kind of community events. We have a wonderful Discord server here where we can host all different types of events. And before we say goodbye, or at least close the formal part of the event, and Michael, I'd love to give you a chance to just finish with any final thoughts that you might have.
Yeah, I pretty appreciate that, Devin. That's been it's always really fun to chat about these things, and also and really exciting to see people kind of want to engage with this material and kind of, if you will, kind of crowdsource our understanding of human energy. I don't think we practice science in these sort of little siloed vacuums, but we really engage in a larger community. And so I hope we can kind of continue to inspire that, and as demonstration of how human energy works. And so that's where I would leave it. Thank you very much.